Jasmine Johnson stands humiliated in the first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 327. Tears welling in her eyes as flight attendant Rebecca Matthews loudly orders her to return to economy. The cabin falls silent as a distinguished man in a tailored suit enters and asks, "Is there a problem with my daughter?" Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe in standing up against injustice, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that expose two sex, the reality many people face every day. Now let's see what happens when assumptions and prejudice collide with unexpected consequences. Jasmine Johnson was having the best week of her young life. At 16, she had already accomplished what many adults only dream of. Her revolutionary algorithm for predicting weather pattern changes had earned her a spot at the National Youth STEM competition in San Francisco. The Stanford University-hosted event was the most prestigious gathering of young scientific minds in the country, and Jasmine had beaten out thousands of applicants nationwide to secure one of just 50 spots. The morning of her departure from Atlanta had been a whirlwind. Her mother, Dr. Kimberly Johnson, a renowned neurosurgeon, had an emergency surgery scheduled and couldn't drive her to the airport. Her father, Marcus Johnson, had been mysteriously unavailable too, citing an unavoidable business commitment. It was unusual for both her parents to miss such a momentous occasion, but Jasmine understood the demands of their careers. They had raised her to be independent after all. "You've got this baby girl," her father had said during their goodbye call. "Text me when you land. I've arranged a little surprise for your journey." That surprise, Jasmine discovered at check-in, was a first-class ticket to San Francisco instead of the economy seat she had expected. She stared at the boarding pass in disbelief. "Is there some mistake?" she asked the check-in agent. The agent smiled. "No mistake. The reservation was upgraded this morning. Looks like someone wants you to travel in style." Jasmine immediately texted her father. "First class, Dad, that's too much." His reply came seconds later. "Nothing but the best for my brilliant daughter. Enjoy every minute. You've earned it." The Johnson family had means. Her parents had worked impossibly hard to build their careers, but they weren't flashy about it. Marcus had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit before putting himself through business school. Kimberly was the daughter of Jamaican immigrants who had worked 3 jobs to support her education. They had instilled in Jasmine the value of humility and the importance of being judged by her character and achievements, not by material possessions or status. As she made her way through security and toward her gate, Jasmine felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This would be her first time flying alone, her first time in first class, and her first national competition. She had deliberately dressed for comfort in her favorite well-worn jeans, Stanford hoodie, a gift from a campus tour last year, and clean but scuffed sneakers. Her curly hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup. Travel days were long enough without having to worry about appearances. When the gate agent announced priority boarding for first-class passengers, Jasmine gathered her carry-on backpack and laptop case. As she approached the gate, she noticed a few curious glances from other first-class passengers, mostly older business people in suits. She felt immediately self-conscious, but reminded herself that her ticket was as valid as anyone else's. "Boarding pass, please, the gate," agent said with a practiced smile. Jasmine handed over her phone with the digital boarding pass displayed. The agent scanned it, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Johnson," she said, returning the phone. As Jasmine made her way down the jet bridge, she mentally rehearsed what she would say to the judges at the competition. Her research could have real-world applications for communities vulnerable to extreme weather events, particularly low-income neighborhoods that often suffered the most during natural disasters. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she barely registered the slight change in the flight attendant's expression as she stepped onto the plane. "Welcome aboard," said the attendant, a blonde woman whose name tag read Rebecca Matthews. Her smile tightened as her eyes moved from Jasmine's face to her casual clothes, then to the first-class boarding pass on her phone. First class is to your right. Jasmine nodded politely and turned toward the first-class cabin, feeling the weight of Rebecca's gaze on her back as she stowed her backpack in the overhead compartment and settled into seat 3 amperes by the window. She couldn't help but notice that Rebecca was warmly greeting the businessman who had boarded behind her, offering to hang up his suit jacket and asking if he'd like a pre-departure beverage. As the cabin gradually filled, Jasmine felt increasingly out of place. She was the only teenager, the only black person, and certainly the most casually dressed passenger in the premium cabin. She pulled out her phone, thinking about texting her father to thank him again, when she noticed Rebecca watching her with narrowed eyes. Little did Jasmine know that what should have been the beginning of an exciting journey was about to become a moment that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone on board. Flight 327. Rebecca Matthews had been a flight attendant with Atlantic Airways for 15 years. She prided herself on her professionalism, her attention to detail, and what she called her intuition about passengers. In reality, this intuition was a complex web of biases she had never bothered to examine. In her mind, first class had a certain look, a certain type, and Jasmine Johnson didn't fit it. As the pre-departure service began, Rebecca moved methodically through the cabin, offering champagne, orange juice, or water to each passenger. When she reached Jasmine's row, she paused briefly before continuing to the businessman seated across the aisle, completely skipping the teenager. "Excuse me," Jasmine said, politely raising her hand slightly. "May I have some water, please?" Rebecca turned her expression cool. "I'll be with you in a moment," she replied before continuing her service to other passengers. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The beverage cart had made a complete circuit of the first-class cabin, and every passenger had been served, except Jasmine. Finally, as Rebecca passed by again, Jasmine spoke up once more. "I'm sorry, but I still haven't received any water." "Right," Rebecca said, barely pausing. "We're preparing for departure now. Beverages will be available once we reach cruising altitude." The businessman across the aisle, Harold Wilson, raised his half-empty champagne flute with a questioning look. Rebecca gave him a conspiratorial smile and topped off his drink. Jasmine felt a flush of embarrassment, but told herself it was probably just an oversight. She turned her attention to her phone, sending her mother a quick text to let her know she had boarded safely. As passengers continued boarding, Rebecca returned to Jasmine's seat, this time with a more direct approach. "Excuse me, can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Jasmine pulled up the digital pass on her phone and showed it to Rebecca. Rebecca studied it with exaggerated care. "Yes, that's me," Jasmine confirmed, increasingly uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "And how did you come to be seated in first class today?" Rebecca's tone implied there must be some mistake or mischief involved. The question caught Jasmine off guard. "My father upgraded my ticket. It was a surprise for my trip." Rebecca's lips thinned. "I see. And what is your father's name?" Jasmine hesitated, unsure why this information was relevant. "Marcus Johnson," she finally answered. "I'm not familiar with that name," Rebecca said, as though this were somehow significant. "And you're traveling alone?" "Yes," Jasmine replied, her voice smaller now. "I'm going to a science competition in San Francisco." By this point, several nearby passengers were watching the interaction with varying expressions. Harold Wilson had put down his newspaper and was openly staring. Across the aisle, a Latina woman in a tailored suit, Alicia Diaz, according to the email she was typing on her laptop, had paused her work, clearly listening. In the row behind Jasmine, an elderly white gentleman named Franklin Carter shifted uncomfortably, while a few seats ahead, Tyler Washington, a black businessman in his 30s, glanced back with a frown of recognition. Rebecca leaned in, lowering her voice just enough that her next words wouldn't carry through the entire cabin, but still audible to those nearby. We've had incidents of people trying to sneak into first class before. It's my job to ensure everyone is in their assigned seat. Jasmine felt her face grow hot. I am in my assigned seat. I showed you my boarding pass. Yes, well, sometimes there are. Mix-ups at the gate, Rebecca persisted. Or people find ways to change their seat assignments in the system. Harold Wilson chose this moment to interject. Is there a problem, flight attendant, I couldn't help but overhear? Rebecca turned to him with a much more respectful expression. Just a routine verification, sir. Nothing to worry about. Well, I have to say, Wilson continued, looking at Jasmine with undisguised suspicion. It does seem unusual. Perhaps she wandered in from coach and got confused. I did not. Jasmine protested, her voice rising slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. This is my assigned seat. My father purchased this ticket. Rebecca straightened up. I think it would be best if you return to your original seat in economy until we can sort this out. But I don't have an economy seat, Jasmine insisted, pulling up her boarding pass again. Look, it says 3 amperes, first class. Young lady, Rebecca said, her voice hardening, if you can't provide adequate verification that you belong in this cabin, I'll have to ask you to move to an available seat in economy, or I'll need to call our security. Officer, Alicia Diaz finally spoke up. Excuse me, but I don't understand the issue. She's shown you her boarding pass. What more verification could you possibly need? Rebecca barely glanced at Alicia. Ma'am, I'm handling this situation according to company protocol. And what protocol is that exactly? Alicia pressed. Harassment based on appearance. Rebecca's face flushed. I'm simply doing my job. If you have concerns about how I perform my duties, you're welcome to contact customer service after the flight. She turned back to Jasmine, who sat frozen, her hands gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles had paled. Now, as I was saying, you need to gather your belongings and move to economy, or I'll be forced to call security and you may be removed from the flight entirely. Jasmine felt the weight of every eye in the cabin. This wasn't the first time she'd faced prejudice, but it had never been so public, so humiliating. She thought of her parents, of what they would do in this situation. Her mother would stand her ground. Her father would remain dignified, but firm. I have a valid ticket for this seat, she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tears threatening to spill. I'm not going anywhere. Rebecca's expression hardened. Very well. She reached for the cabin phone. I'm calling security. As she dialed, Harold Wilson nodded approvingly, while Alicia Diaz shook her head in disgust. Franklin Carter stared fixedly at his hands, and Tyler Washington closed his eyes briefly, as though all too familiar with what was unfolding. Jasmine, feeling a wave of panic, quickly dialed her father's number. The call went to voicemail after 2 rings. Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. There's a problem on the plane. The flight attendant doesn't believe I belong in first class. They're calling security. I don't know what to... Please put your phone away, Rebecca interrupted sharply. All electronic devices must be in airplane mode for departure. As Jasmine lowered her phone, the full weight of her situation hit her. Alone, disbelieved, and about to be forcibly removed from a seat she had every right to occupy, all because she didn't fit someone's image of who belonged in first class. Alicia Diaz had been watching the situation unfold with growing indignation. As the chief marketing officer for a Fortune 500 tech company, she was no stranger to being underestimated or out of place in predominantly white male spaces. She had fought her way up from a childhood in East Los Angeles to Stanford and then Harvard Business School, battling stereotypes and microaggressions at every step. This is completely unacceptable, she said, standing up from her seat. I've been flying first class with Atlantic Airways for years, and I've never seen anyone subjected to this kind of scrutiny. Rebecca barely acknowledged her. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. This doesn't concern you." "It absolutely concerns me," Alicia replied firmly. "As a frequent flyer who spends thousands with your airline, I'm witnessing discrimination in real time, and I won't be silent about it." Rebecca's expression flickered momentarily before she reasserted her professional mask. "This isn't about discrimination. It's about security and proper verification." "Then verify my boarding pass too," Alicia challenged. "Or his," she added, pointing to Harold Wilson. "Why is she the only one being questioned?" Wilson puffed up defensively. "Now see here, I'm a platinum executive member with over 2 million miles. The flight attendant knows me." "She doesn't know me," Alicia countered, "yet she didn't question my right to be here. What's the difference, I wonder?" The question hung in the air, its implication crystal clear. 2 rows behind them, Franklin Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. At 78, the retired federal judge had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize injustice when it was happening right in front of him. He had presided over civil rights cases in the 72nds and 82nds, and while he liked to believe America had made progress, moments like this reminded him how far the country still had to go. He should say something he knew. His position and privilege as an elderly white man afforded him a credibility that neither Jasmine nor Alicia would be granted automatically. But he hesitated, telling himself it wasn't his place to interfere, that the airline staff knew their jobs better than he did. Even as these rationalizations ran through his mind, he recognized them for what they were, the same excuses that had allowed injustice to persist throughout history. The uncomfortable truth was that he was tired. He didn't want conflict, and he was taking the path of least resistance. As he grappled with his conscience, he caught the eye of Tyler Washington, who was watching him with a knowing expression. Tyler himself was in a complex position. As a black executive who had navigated predominantly white corporate spaces his entire career, he was intimately familiar with the calculations Jasmine was being forced to make. Stand up for yourself and risk being labeled angry or difficult, or swallow the injustice and maintain the peace at the cost of your dignity. He had his own reasons for not wanting to get involved. He was heading to San Francisco for a crucial business meeting, and a confrontation that could potentially lead to his removal from the flight would jeopardize everything he'd worked for. Yet watching this young girl being humiliated stirred something deep within him, a responsibility to the next generation to ensure they wouldn't have to face the same battles he had. Meanwhile, whispers were spreading throughout the cabin. Some passengers kept their heads down, pretending not to notice. Others watched openly, their expressions ranging from discomfort to curiosity to outright enjoyment of the drama. A few had begun surreptitiously recording the incident on their phones. "I'm telling you," Harold Wilson said loudly, to no one in particular, "I've seen this before. People trying to scam their way into upgrades. They think the rules don't apply to them." His comment seemed to embolden a couple of other passengers who nodded in agreement. The cabin was slowly dividing into factions, those who saw the injustice unfolding, and those who, whether from bias or a desire for a peaceful flight, were siding with Rebecca. "Young lady," Rebecca said, turning back to Jasmine's security is on the way. "I'll give you one last opportunity to voluntarily move to economy class." Jasmine, fighting to maintain her composure, looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of those who would witness whatever came next. She saw Alicia's outrage, Franklin's discomfort, Tyler's conflicted expression, and Harold's smug certainty. "I'm going to call my father again," she said, reaching for her phone with trembling hands. "I've told you to put that away," Rebecca snapped. "We're about to close the doors for departure." "At least let her make a call," Alicia interjected. "She's a minor, traveling alone. She should have thought about that before attempting to sit where she doesn't belong," Harold muttered, just loudly enough to be heard. Alicia turned on him. "And where exactly do you think she belongs, sir?" The tension in the cabin was palpable as the confrontation escalated. Jasmine, caught in the middle, felt smaller by the second. She had spent years being the only black girl in advanced placement classes, academic competitions, and science fairs. She had developed a thick skin and learned to let her achievements speak for themselves. But nothing had prepared her for this public humiliation, for being made to feel like an intruder in a space her father had legitimately paid for her to occupy. As Rebecca spoke quietly into the cabin phone summoning security, Jasmine sent a quick text to her father. "Dad, emergency. Being kicked out of first class. Flight attendant doesn't believe my ticket is real. Please, call the airline." The message sent just as Rebecca turned back to her. "Security will be here momentarily. I suggest you gather your belongings now to avoid further embarrassment." Tyler Washington finally spoke up. "I'd like to see your supervisor before any passenger is removed from this flight." Rebecca's expression tightened. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't your concern. It became my concern when you began targeting a minor, traveling alone," Tyler replied calmly but firmly. "I'd like to speak with the captain or your supervisor before this goes any further." As these words hung in the air, the cabin door reopened and a security officer stepped into the aircraft. The confrontation was about to reach its breaking point, and no one, not Jasmine, not Rebecca, not any of the witnesses, could predict what would happen next. James Peterson had been working as a flight security officer for Atlantic Airways for nearly 8 years. At 45, the former police officer had seen his share of disruptive passengers, drunken businessmen, and entitled travelers. When he received the call about a situation in first class, he'd expected another intoxicated passenger refusing to comply with mask regulations or someone trying to smoke in the lavatory. He hadn't expected to find a teenager at the center of the commotion. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, addressing Rebecca rather than Jasmine. Rebecca straightened her uniform jacket. "This young woman cannot adequately verify her right to be in first class. I believe she may have snuck in from economy or manipulated her boarding pass. She's been uncooperative and disruptive." Jasmine opened her mouth to protest, but Alicia Diaz spoke first. "That is absolutely false. I've witnessed this entire interaction, and this young lady has been nothing but polite while being subjected to blatant discrimination." James's gaze moved between them, assessing the situation. "Let's keep things calm," he said, his tone measured. "Miss, can I see your boarding pass, please?" Jasmine held out her phone once more, her hand still trembling slightly. "Here, it clearly shows seat 3 amperes, first class." James examined the digital pass, then looked back at Rebecca. "The boarding pass appears valid. What's the issue?" Rebecca lowered her voice, though not enough to prevent those nearby from hearing. "Look at her. Does she look like she belongs in first class? No luggage dressed like that. Something's not right, and it's my responsibility to ensure the security of this cabin." The implication hung in the air, unmistakable in its meaning. It wasn't about the boarding pass at all. It was about who Jasmine was, or rather who Rebecca perceived her to be, based on her age, her race, and her casual attire. James hesitated, glancing around at the other passengers. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he was acutely aware that whatever decision he made would be scrutinized not just by those present, but potentially by his supervisors later. The easiest path would be to remove Jasmine one passenger's inconvenience versus delaying an entire flight. "Miss," he said, finally, turning back to Jasmine, "while your boarding pass appears valid, perhaps there was a misunderstanding or system error. For now, would you be willing to move to an available seat in economy to allow the flight to depart on time? We can sort this out properly once we're airborne." Alicia immediately stood up again. "Absolutely not. This is outrageous. I'm recording this entire incident, and I will be sending it directly to your corporate headquarters." She had indeed pulled out her phone and was openly filming now. Harold Wilson scoffed loudly. "Oh, for heaven's sake, just move the girl and let's get on with it. Some of us have important meetings to get to." Tyler Washington stood as well. And some of us believe that treating people with basic dignity is more important than making our meetings on time. The cabin had erupted into a flurry of whispers and exclamations. Several passengers in economy, curious about the delay, had gathered near the divider to peer into the first-class section. The confrontation had become a spectacle. Rebecca's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. What should have been a routine departure had spiraled completely out of her control. "James," she said to the security officer, "I need this passenger removed now. She's causing a disturbance that's delaying our departure." James nodded grimly. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. We can discuss this further in the terminal." Tears of frustration and humiliation finally spilled down Jasmine's cheeks. She had done nothing wrong, had broken no rules, yet she was being treated like a criminal. She thought of her parents, of how they had taught her to stand up for herself, but also to recognize when a situation had become unsafe. This felt dangerously close to that line. "Fine," she whispered, reaching for her backpack. "I'll go." As she stood, Alicia reached out and squeezed her arm in a gesture of solidarity. Tyler Washington shook his head in disgust, while Franklin Carter stared fixedly at the floor, shame evident in his posture. Harold Wilson adjusted his tie with a satisfied expression. With as much dignity as she could muster, Jasmine began to gather her belongings, wiping tears from her face. The walk of shame had begun past the judgmental stares, the awkward glances, the pitying expressions. She felt stripped, bare her accomplishments, her intelligence, her very humanity, reduced to nothing in the face of prejudice. She had nearly reached the divider between first class and economy when a commotion at the front of the plane caught everyone's attention. The cabin door had reopened, and a man in an impeccably tailored suit was stepping aboard. Marcus Johnson moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to command. His presence immediately altered the energy in the cabin. The captain himself had come to greet him at the door, an unusual courtesy that didn't go unnoticed by the passengers. "Mr. Johnson, this is unexpected. Is there something we can help you with?" the captain asked. "I received a concerning message from my daughter," Marcus replied, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "She's on this flight." His gaze swept the cabin until it landed on Jasmine standing frozen in the aisle, with tear tracks on her face, security officer beside her. In an instant, his expression transformed from concern to cold fury. "Jasmine, what's happening here?" he asked, striding toward her. Before she could answer, Rebecca stepped forward, her customer service smile firmly in place. "Sir, I'm afraid you'll need to deplane immediately. We're preparing for departure, and—" Marcus cut her off with a raised hand. "I'm not going anywhere until I understand why my daughter is in tears and apparently being removed from a seat I personally paid for." Rebecca's smile faltered. "Sir, there was some question about the validity of her ticket and you determined my daughter was somehow not entitled to sit in first class." Marcus finished for her. "On what basis exactly?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the cabin knew the answer, but no one dared speak it aloud. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, handing it to Rebecca. "I'm Marcus Johnson, Chief Executive Officer of Atlantic Airways. This is my 16-year-old daughter, Jasmine, who is traveling to a national science competition representing some of the brightest young minds in this country. Now, would someone like to explain to me why she's being treated like a criminal on my airline?" Did you just feel that twist? What would you have done in Jasmine's position? Would you have stood your ground or walked away? Comment number 1 if you believe Rebecca should be immediately fired for her actions, or comment number 2 if you think she deserves a chance to explain herself. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're as shocked as I am by this story, and subscribe for more real-life dramas that expose the prejudices still alive in our society. But wait, what do you think happens next? Will Marcus Johnson's revelation change everything, or is this just the beginning of an even bigger confrontation? Let's find out. The cabin fell into stunned silence as Marcus Johnson's words registered. Rebecca Matthews stared at the business card in her hand, the Atlantic Airways logo gleaming beneath the cabin lights. Marcus's title, unmistakable Chief Executive Officer. The blood drained from her face. Mr. Johnson the First. There must be some misunderstanding. We were simply following protocol for what Marcus interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. For passengers who look like my daughter, because I've been running this airline for 7 years. Miss, Matthews and I don't recall any protocol that instructs flight attendants to publicly humiliate teenagers based on assumptions about where they belong. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the atmosphere electric with tension. Harold Wilson, who had been so vocal in his support of Rebecca's actions, suddenly seemed intensely interested in his phone screen. When he finally looked up, he attempted to salvage his position. Mr. Johnson, sir, we were all just concerned about maintaining the standards of service that make Atlantic Airways so exceptional. I'm sure the young lady understands it was nothing personal. Marcus turned to him, his expression impassive but his eyes cold. And you are? Harold Wilson, sir. Executive Vice President at Meridian Financial. Platinum executive member of your airline's loyalty program for the past decade. He extended his hand with a confident smile. Marcus deliberately ignored the outstretched hand. Mr. Wilson, I suggest you reflect on how your actions contributed to my daughter's distress. Atlantic Airways values all its passengers equally regardless of their age, race, or attire. That's the standard I expect. Wilson's hand dropped, his face reddening. Marcus turned to James Peterson, the security officer who still stood awkwardly beside Jasmine. And you were about to remove my daughter from this flight. James straightened, years of authority response kicking in. Sir, I was responding to a crew member's request for assistance with a passenger. I was trying to de-escalate the situation. By removing the victim, rather than addressing the misconduct, Marcus noted, interesting approach to de-escalation. He gently placed his arm around Jasmine's shoulders. Are you all right? She nodded, wiping away the last of her tears, strength returning to her posture now that she wasn't facing the situation alone. I'm okay, Dad. Marcus addressed the cabin at large. I'd like to apologize to everyone for the delay. This is not the experience we strive to provide at Atlantic Airways. Then, in a lower voice to Rebecca, may I see your employee ID, please? Rebecca's hand trembled as she unclipped the ID from her uniform and handed it over. Marcus studied it briefly, then pulled out his phone. Karen, it's Marcus. I need you to connect me with Thomas Reynolds immediately. Yes, the Director of Flight Services. I'm on Flight 327, and we have a situation that requires his attention. He paused, listening. Yes, I understand he's in a meeting. Interrupt it. While they waited, Alicia Diaz approached. Mr. Johnson, I'm Alicia Diaz, CMO at Horizon Tech. I witnessed the entire incident and have most of it recorded. Your daughter conducted herself with remarkable poise under incredibly difficult circumstances. You should be very proud. Marcus nodded gratefully. Thank you, Miss Diaz. I appreciate your speaking up for Jasmine when I couldn't be here. Across the aisle, Franklin Carter finally found his voice. Sir, I should have said something sooner. I'm Franklin Carter, retired federal judge. What happened here was wrong, and my silence made me complicit. I'd be willing to provide a formal statement about what I witnessed. That would be helpful, Your Honor. Thank you, Marcus replied, just as his call connected. Thomas Marcus Johnson here. I'm currently on Flight 327 out of Atlanta, where I just witnessed my daughter being racially profiled and nearly removed from first class by one of your flight attendants, despite having a valid ticket. He listened briefly. Yes, that's correct. I'll need a replacement attendant for this flight, and I want Miss Matthews on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Another pause. 20 minutes is acceptable. Thank you. He ended the call and turned to Rebecca. A replacement flight attendant will be here shortly. In the meantime, please gather your belongings and wait in the terminal. Someone from HR will contact you today. Rebecca's professional facade crumbled entirely. Mr. Johnson, please, this is a terrible misunderstanding. I've been with Atlantic Airways for 15 years with an impeccable record. I would never discriminate against a passenger based on race Marcus finished for her. And yet that's precisely what every witness in this cabin observed you doing. Actions have consequences, Miss Matthews. As an employee wearing our uniform, you represent everything this airline stands for. Or in this case, everything it stands against. Harold Wilson, sensing the shift in power dynamics, attempted once more to align himself with the winning side. Absolutely disgraceful behavior, he muttered loudly. I was just about to say something myself. Tyler Washington, who had been quietly observing, couldn't contain a short, sardonic laugh. Were you now Mr. Wilson Strange? Since just minutes ago you were suggesting she had scammed her way into first class. Wilson's face flushed crimson. Now see here, that's a gross mischaracterization of... I recorded that part too, Alicia interrupted, holding up her phone, along with several other choice comments you made. By now, passengers from economy had gathered near the divider, many filming the unfolding drama. The story was already spreading through the aircraft, whispers and shocked expressions cascading from row to row like a wave. Marcus assessed the situation, then made a decision. Miss Matthews, you'll be escorted off the aircraft now. Mr. Wilson Atlantic Airways will be reviewing your status in our loyalty program. I personally believe that true loyalty includes respecting all of our passengers. He turned to the security officer. Mr. Peterson, please escort Miss Matthews to the terminal and remain with her until HR representatives arrive. As Rebecca gathered her belongings, her movements mechanical and her expression stunned, Marcus addressed the cabin once more. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize again for the delay. A new flight attendant will be joining us shortly, and we'll be on our way to San Francisco as quickly as possible. In the meantime, I'd like to thank those of you who spoke up for my daughter, and I hope this incident serves as a reminder that at Atlantic Airways, we judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin or the clothes they wear. A smattering of applause broke out among the passengers, growing stronger as more joined in. Rebecca Matthews walked down the aisle, and off the plane her 15-year career effectively ended by 15 minutes of unchecked bias. As the cabin door closed behind her, Marcus turned to Jasmine. I'm so sorry you had to experience that, sweetheart. She hugged him tightly. Thanks for coming, Dad. But how did you know? And how did you get here so fast? Marcus smiled. Your text came through just as I was finishing a meeting at the Atlanta corporate office. I was already at the airport. He lowered his voice. And the mysterious, unavoidable business commitment that kept me from driving you. I was planning to surprise you by being on this flight all along, just seated in the back so you could have your independence. I wanted to be there for your big moment without hovering. Jasmine laughed through residual tears. So much for that plan. Indeed, Marcus agreed. Now I should probably get back to my seat in economy before they bring in the new flight attendant. Wait, Jasmine said. Stay in first class with me, please, just for this flight. Marcus hesitated only briefly before nodding. I think I can make an exception to our usual low-key approach just this once. As they settled into their seats, the energy in the cabin had transformed. What had begun as a scene of discrimination and humiliation had become something unexpected. A powerful lesson in consequences, accountability, and the importance of speaking up against injustice. The replacement flight attendant arrived 15 minutes later, apologizing profusely to both Marcus and Jasmine before delivering impeccable service to every passenger for the remainder of the flight. The journey to San Francisco continued, but for everyone on board, Flight 327, something fundamental had changed. They had witnessed both the ugly reality of everyday racism and the rare satisfaction of seeing it confronted and defeated in real time. What none of them realized yet was that this incident, contained within the metal tube of a commercial aircraft at 30,000 feet, would soon break free of those confines and ripple through the corporate world in ways no one, not even Marcus Johnson, could fully anticipate. As Flight 327 reached cruising altitude, an uneasy calm settled over the first-class cabin. The replacement flight attendant, Michael Chen, moved through the space with practiced efficiency, his service impeccable and absolutely equal for every passenger. The contrast with Rebecca Matthews' behavior was striking and not lost on anyone. Jasmine sat quietly next to the window, her father beside her, in what should have been another passenger seat. The airline had quickly accommodated the CEO's presence, moving the displaced passenger to a premium seat in economy with profuse apologies and generous compensation. "You're being awfully quiet," Marcus observed softly as Michael served them drinks. "What's going on in that brilliant mind of yours?" Jasmine stared at the clouds below her reflection ghostly in the window. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. If I'd just been Jasmine Johnson, regular black girl, not Jasmine Johnson, daughter of the CEO." Marcus considered this, his expression somber. "It's a valid question, one I've thought about many times throughout my career. I've dealt with microaggressions before," Jasmine continued. "The surprised looks when I win science competitions. Teachers assuming I need extra help until they see my test scores. But this was different. This was so public. So humiliating." Marcus nodded, anger flashing in his eyes again before he controlled it. "What you experienced is something most Black Americans face at some point, regardless of their achievements or status. The difference is usually there's no recourse, no immediate justice." He paused. "I'm sorry you had to learn that lesson this way, but I'm even more sorry that the lesson still needs to be learned at all." "How do you handle it?" Jasmine asked. "Knowing that no matter what you accomplish, some people will always see your skin first." "With dignity," Marcus replied without hesitation. "The same dignity I saw in you today, even with tears on your face. We can't control how others perceive us, but we can control how we respond." He smiled slightly. "And occasionally, when we're in a position to create consequences for discriminatory behavior, we do that too." Their conversation was interrupted by Alicia Diaz, who approached with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I wanted to properly introduce myself." She extended her hand first to Jasmine, then to Marcus. "What happened today was inexcusable, and I admire how you both handled it." "Thank you for speaking up," Marcus replied. "Too often these incidents go unchallenged because bystanders stay silent." Alicia nodded. "I've been that silent bystander before, and I've been the person nobody stood up for. Neither feels good." She turned to Jasmine. "I couldn't help overhearing that you're heading to a science competition. What's your field?" Jasmine's expression brightened. "Computational meteorology. I've developed an algorithm that can predict extreme weather patterns in vulnerable communities with greater accuracy than current models." "That's incredible," Alicia said, visibly impressed. "I started my career in environmental science before transitioning to tech. The applications for that kind of algorithm could be life-saving." "That's the goal," Jasmine replied. "After Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, I realized how much more devastation affects low-income communities and how earlier warnings could help." They fell into a conversation about data modeling and predictive analytics, Jasmine's earlier distress, temporarily forgotten in her enthusiasm for her work. Marcus watched with pride, content to let the two connect. A few rows ahead, Tyler Washington had been observing the interaction. After several minutes of internal debate, he rose from his seat and made his way to where they Saturday. "Excuse me," he said, addressing both Marcus and Jasmine. "I wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I should have said something the moment I saw what was happening." Marcus assessed him thoughtfully. You did speak up eventually. That's more than most. Tyler shook his head. Not soon enough. I was calculating the professional risk to myself if I got involved in a confrontation that could delay my flight and make me miss my meeting. His expression was heavy with self-recrimination, the exact kind of calculation I promised myself I'd never make again when I reached a position of influence. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Jasmine. Tyler Washington, VP of Operations at Kinetic Solutions. If you ever need anything, a mentor, an internship, someone to talk to about navigating spaces that weren't built for people who look like us, please don't hesitate to reach out. Jasmine accepted the card with a smile. Thank you, Mr. Washington. Tyler, please, he insisted, then glanced at Marcus. You've raised an impressive young woman, Mr. Johnson. Her composure under fire speaks volumes. As Tyler returned to his seat, the conversation in the cabin gradually resumed its normal volume, though the subject matter had decidedly shifted. Passengers were discussing what they had witnessed, debating the appropriate consequences, reflecting on similar incidents they had seen or experienced. What had been a routine first-class cabin had transformed into a space for uncomfortable but necessary conversations about race and privilege. Meanwhile, Harold Wilson sat in increasingly uncomfortable isolation. Other passengers had subtly shifted away from him, leaving an empty seat on either side. His attempts to engage his neighbors in conversation were met with polite but curt responses before they turned away. The social consequences of his behavior were immediate and unambiguous. After nearly an hour of this treatment, Wilson finally gathered his courage and approached Marcus and Jasmine. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Mr. Johnson, Miss Johnson, he began, his usual confidence notably diminished. I want to express my sincerest apologies for my role in what transpired earlier. My comments were inappropriate and unthinking. I hope you can forgive this lapse in judgment. The apology was perfectly worded but utterly devoid of genuine understanding. It was the practiced contrition of a man accustomed to smoothing over social faux pas with well-chosen phrases. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Mr. Wilson, I appreciate you coming over here, but I'm curious, are you sorry for what you said, or sorry that you said it to the CEO's daughter? Wilson blinked, rapidly caught off guard by the directness of the question. Of course, the behavior itself was inexcusable regardless of who. Because Marcus continued calmly, if it had been any other young black person sitting in that seat, someone without connections or power, or a father who could immediately rectify the situation, would you still be here apologizing? Or would you simply have gone about your day satisfied that the natural order had been restored when they were removed from a space you didn't believe they belonged in? Wilson's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. That's not fair. I'm not a racist. I simply thought. That's the problem, Mr. Wilson. You didn't think. You saw a young black person in first class and automatically assumed they didn't belong there. That's the definition of prejudice. Marcus's tone remained measured, educational rather than accusatory. I'm not interested in performative apologies. I'm interested in changed behavior. So, perhaps instead of seeking absolution from us, you might spend this flight reflecting on the assumptions you make about people based solely on their appearance. Wilson stood frozen, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to this way. Finally, he managed a stiff nod before retreating to his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment and indignation. As the flight continued, Marcus excused himself to make several phone calls from the galley area, speaking in low, intense tones. When he returned to his seat, Jasmine gave him a questioning look. Just setting a few wheels in motion, he explained cryptically. What happened today isn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It's about a culture that allowed her to believe that behavior was acceptable. and a system that might have protected her if circumstances had been different. "Are you going to fire her?" Jasmine asked directly. Marcus considered the question carefully. "That's not a decision I'll make unilaterally. There will be an investigation, and HR will follow our established protocols. But I will ensure that whatever action is taken addresses the root issues, not just the symptoms." Jasmine nodded, satisfied with the answer. As they settled back into comfortable conversation, with Alicia occasionally joining in, the flight continued its journey westward. Outside, the landscape below transformed from the lush green of Georgia to the golden plains of the Midwest, and eventually to the rugged mountains of the West. Inside the aircraft, a different kind of transformation was taking place, one that would continue long after Flight 327 touched down in San Francisco, rippling outward to affect not just those on board, but an entire corporate culture. And perhaps in some small way, the broader conversation about race and belonging in America. The Atlantic Airways corporate headquarters in Atlanta buzzed with unusual activity for a Saturday. Executives who had been enjoying weekend plans with their families found themselves rushing to the office, hastily dressed and clutching travel coffee mugs. The boardroom on the top floor, usually reserved for quarterly meetings and major announcements, was being prepared for an emergency session. Thomas Reynolds, Director of Flight Services, and Rebecca Matthews, Ultimate Superior, paced nervously by the floor-to-ceiling windows. His reflection showed a man in his 50s with prematurely white hair and the harried expression of someone whose weekend had just imploded. His phone buzzed with yet another message from the PR department requesting his presence at their crisis management meeting immediately following the board session. The door opened, and Vanessa Clark, Chief Operations Officer and Marcus Johnson, second-in-command, entered with a tablet in hand. "The video's gone viral," she announced, without preamble. "Over 2 million views already. Number Atlantic Airways racism is trending nationwide." Thomas groaned. "How bad is it?" "It shows everything from the moment Rebecca confronted Jasmine until Marcus revealed himself as CEO," Vanessa replied. "The passenger who recorded it, Alicia Diaz, has 20 million followers across her social platforms. She's a respected tech executive with a history of speaking out about workplace discrimination." "Perfect," Thomas muttered sarcastically. "Any statement from Matthews yet?" "Her union rep has advised against public comments during the investigation, but she's telling colleagues it was a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion." Vanessa's expression made it clear what she thought of that defense. "HR has her on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of our investigation." The boardroom gradually filled as more executives arrived. The tension was palpable. This was not a routine corporate crisis. It touched on issues that were simultaneously deeply personal and broadly systemic, with implications that extended far beyond public relations damage control. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Marcus Johnson entered the room. Everyone immediately fell silent. "I appreciate you all coming in on short notice," he began, taking his seat at the head of the table. "As you're aware, an incident occurred this morning on Flight 327 that raises serious concerns about our corporate culture, our training procedures, and our commitment to the values this airline claims to uphold." He recounted the events dispassionately, his CEO persona firmly in place despite the personal nature of the incident. When he finished, he looked around the table. Questions. Angela Patel, Chief of Human Resources, spoke first. "I've reviewed Ms. Matthews' personnel file. There have been 3 previous complaints about similar behavior, all from passengers of color who felt they were treated differently than white passengers in first class. None resulted in disciplinary action." A murmur ran through the room. "Why not?" Marcus asked, his tone deceptively mild. Angela shifted uncomfortably. "The investigations concluded there was insufficient evidence of bias. The complaints were categorized as customer service issues rather than discrimination incidents." "And who conducted those investigations?" "Her direct supervisor, James Miller, In consultation with the regional manager, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. So, we have a pattern of behavior that was identified, reported, and then essentially dismissed by the same management structure that was responsible for her training and supervision. This isn't just about Rebecca Matthews. This is a systemic failure. No one could argue with that assessment. The implications hung heavily in the air. Robert Chen, Chief Marketing Officer, cleared his throat. From a brand perspective, we're facing significant damage. Our internal metrics show a 43% negative sentiment shift on social media in the past 4 hours. Booking inquiries have dropped 28% compared to the same period last week. I'm less concerned about the short-term financial impact than the long-term cultural implications, Marcus replied. But I understand the business realities. What's your recommendation? We need to go beyond the standard PR playbook, Robert said firmly. A generic apology and promise to do better won't cut it. We need concrete, visible actions that demonstrate genuine commitment to change. The discussion continued, growing increasingly heated as executives debated various approaches. Some advocated for swift, decisive action, immediate termination of Matthews, and any supervisors who had dismissed previous complaints. Others cautioned against reactive measures that might create legal vulnerabilities or appear performative rather than substantive. Throughout the debate, Marcus remained mostly silent, listening carefully to each perspective. Only when the conversation began to circle back on itself did he intervene. We seem to be focusing on how to manage the public perception of this incident, he observed. That's necessary, but insufficient. I'm more interested in how we ensure it never happens again, not just with Rebecca Matthews, but with any employee who might share her biases. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Atlanta skyline. When I became CEO of this airline 7 years ago, I spoke about making Atlantic Airways a leader, not just in customer service and profitability, but in equity and inclusion. I talked about building a corporate culture that reflected the diversity of the communities we serve. Turning back to face the room, his expression was resolute. Today made it abundantly clear that we've failed in that mission. The systems we put in place to identify and address discrimination were inadequate at best, complicit at worst. The training we provide clearly isn't translating into behavior change. And most concerning of all, an employee felt comfortable enough in her bias to publicly humiliate a teenager based solely on assumptions about where she belonged. The room fell silent, the truth of his words impossible to deny. So Marcus continued, instead of asking how we manage this crisis, I want us to ask a different question. How do we transform this moment into meaningful, lasting change? For the next 3 hours, the executive team grappled with this challenge. By the time they emerged, they had outlined a comprehensive approach that went far beyond damage control. It included a top-to-bottom review of hiring, training, and complaint resolution procedures, the formation of a diversity and inclusion task force with real authority, revised metrics for measuring and rewarding inclusive behavior, and significant changes to leadership in key departments. As the meeting dispersed, Marcus remained behind with Vanessa Clark. There's one more issue we need to discuss, he said, pulling up an email on his tablet. Harold Wilson. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. The passenger who backed Matthews? The same. He's executive vice president at Meridian Financial, one of our largest corporate clients. Their employees take over 10,000 flights with us annually, worth approximately $30 million in revenue. Ah, Vanessa said, understanding immediately. And I'm guessing he's none too pleased about being publicly called out by the CEO. His company has already reached out through back channels, Marcus confirmed. They're suggesting this was all an unfortunate misunderstanding and hoping we can move forward constructively without any unnecessary complications. Meaning they want us to pretend it never happened. Vanessa translated. Exactly. The question is, do we prioritize $30 million in revenue, or do we stand by the principles we just spent 3 hours discussing? Vanessa didn't hesitate. If we cave on this, every word we said in that boardroom becomes meaningless. Marcus smiled slightly. That's why you're my COO. Draft a response, making it clear that while we value Meridian's business, we expect all passengers to treat our staff and fellow travelers with dignity and respect. Include the video link with a timestamp of Wilson's specific comments and copy their chief diversity officer and board chair. You know they might pull their business, Vanessa warned. They might, Marcus acknowledged. Or they might realize that having an executive who makes blatantly discriminatory comments on camera represents a significant liability for them as well. He shrugged. Either way, we'll know exactly how committed they are to the diversity pledges on their website. As Vanessa left to draft the email, Marcus looked once more at the Atlanta skyline. The city below was a complex tapestry of communities, histories, and ongoing struggles for equality. As a black man who had risen to lead a major corporation, he was acutely aware of both how far America had come and how far it had yet to go. Today's incident with Jasmine had made the abstract personal in a way that cut deep, but it had also created an opportunity to transform Atlantic Airways from a company with diversity statements into one with truly inclusive practices. The path forward wouldn't be easy or comfortable, but it was necessary. His phone chimed with a text from Jasmine, landed safely in SF. Already met 2 other black girls in the competition. How are things in Atlanta? Marcus smiled as he typed his response. Challenging but productive. Making changes that should have happened long ago. So proud of you. Knock 'em dead tomorrow. He put the phone away, gathered his papers, and headed for the door. The work was just beginning. 3 months after the incident on Flight 327, Alicia Diaz found herself back in Atlanta, this time by invitation. She stepped into the renovated training center at Atlantic Airways headquarters, impressed by the transformation. What had once been a sterile corporate space was now filled with interactive exhibits chronicling the airline's history, including its failures and lessons learned. Miss Diaz, welcome, called a familiar voice. Marcus Johnson approached with an extended hand. Thank you for making time in your schedule to join us today. After what happened, I couldn't say no to your invitation, Alicia replied, shaking his hand firmly, though I'll admit I was surprised to receive it. Marcus gestured toward the training room, where dozens of Atlantic Airways employees from flight attendants to executives were gathering. We're implementing comprehensive bias training across the entire organization. But I didn't want theoretical workshops led by consultants who've never experienced discrimination firsthand. I wanted real stories from real people. Alicia nodded in understanding. And you thought my perspective would be valuable. Your video forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, Marcus said frankly. But more importantly, your willingness to speak up in that moment, to be an active bystander rather than a passive observer, exemplifies exactly what we're trying to teach. They entered the training room where Alicia was introduced as the day's guest speaker. For the next hour, she shared her experiences as a Latina executive navigating predominantly white corporate spaces, including the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination she had witnessed and experienced. The employees listened with rapt attention, many nodding in recognition of situations they had observed or endured themselves. When I saw what was happening to Jasmine, Alicia concluded, I knew I had 2 choices. I could mind my own business and remain comfortable, or I could speak up and risk conflict. What made the difference was remembering all the times no one spoke up for me. After the session, as employees broke into discussion groups, Marcus gave Alicia a tour of the changes implemented since the incident. The transformation went far beyond sensitivity training. Atlantic Airways had established a diversity advisory board with real authority to review policies and practices. Alicia was surprised to learn she had been unanimously selected as its chairperson. "We need outside perspectives," Marcus explained as they walked through the operations center. "People who will hold us accountable rather than protect the status quo." The tour continued to the customer service department where a completely revamped complaint system had been implemented. Discrimination complaints were now routed directly to a specialized team with expertise in bias incidents, bypassing the traditional hierarchy that had buried previous reports. "What about Rebecca Matthews?" Alicia finally asked the question that had been on her mind since arriving. Marcus's expression turned somber. "She was terminated after our investigation confirmed a pattern of discriminatory behavior. But we also held her supervisors accountable for ignoring previous complaints. 3 management-level employees were either reassigned or let go." They paused at a window overlooking the tarmac where planes bearing the Atlantic Airways logo took off and landed in a carefully choreographed dance. "The easy part was firing one flight attendant," Marcus continued. "The harder part has been examining the culture that enabled her behavior and the systems that protected her. That's the work that matters, and it's ongoing." Across town in a modest apartment, Rebecca Matthews sat at her kitchen table staring at her laptop screen. The past 3 months had been the most difficult of her life. After her termination, she had become briefly infamous, her face and name appearing in news stories and social media posts across the country. She had received hate mail, lost friends, and found herself essentially unhireable in the airline industry she had dedicated her adult life to. The experience had forced her into painful self-reflection. Initially defensive and convinced she had been scapegoated, Rebecca had gradually come to recognize the biases that had informed her actions that day and throughout her career. The realization was humbling and deeply uncomfortable. On her screen was a draft of a public apology she had been working on for weeks, addressed to Jasmine Johnson specifically, and to all passengers she had ever made feel unwelcome more broadly. She hadn't yet found the courage to send it, unsure if it would be received as genuine contrition or dismissed as damage control. A notification popped up on her screen, an email from a diversity education nonprofit where she had applied for a volunteer position sharing her experience as a case study in unconscious bias. The subject line read, "Application status accepted." Her hand trembled slightly as she opened it. Meanwhile, in downtown Atlanta, Tyler Washington was hosting the inaugural meeting of Wingspan, a mentorship program for minority youth interested in aviation careers. The conference room at Kinetic Solutions was filled with 20 high school students, all from underrepresented backgrounds, all brilliant and full of potential. "The aviation industry isn't just pilots and flight attendants," Tyler explained as he moved through his presentation. "It's engineers, air traffic controllers, operations specialists, customer service professionals, business strategists, marketers, and yes, executives and CEOs." His gaze swept over the eager faces. "Some doors that were closed to previous generations are now open, but you'll still face obstacles and biases. My job, our job, is to help you navigate those challenges and ensure your talent isn't overlooked because of who you are or where you come from." The program had come together remarkably quickly after Tyler had shared his idea with Marcus Johnson. Atlantic Airways had immediately signed on as the primary sponsor, providing funding, internship opportunities, and access to facilities and professionals throughout the organization. At the back of the room, a special guest observed quietly. Franklin Carter, the retired federal judge who had remained silent during the critical moments of the confrontation with Rebecca, had contacted Tyler after the flight with an unexpected proposition. He wanted to establish a scholarship fund for the program participants. "I spent decades presiding over civil rights cases," he had explained when they met. "I saw systemic discrimination laid bare in my courtroom day after day, and yet when confronted with it in person, I froze. I chose comfort over courage." He had looked at Tyler with eyes clouded by regret, but also determination. "I can't change what I did, or rather what I failed to do on that flight. But I can help ensure that the next generation has more courage than I did." The scholarship fund now had over $3 million in capital, ensuring that finances would never be the barrier, preventing these young people from pursuing their dreams in aviation. As the session wrapped up, Tyler noticed one student hanging back, seemingly hesitant to leave. He approached the young man with a friendly smile. "Something on your mind, David?" David shuffled his feet. "Mr. Washington, I wanted to say thank you. Before this program, I didn't know anyone who looked like me in the aviation industry. I didn't think there was a place for someone like me." Tyler placed a hand on the teenager's shoulder. "There's not just a place for you, David. There's a need for you. This industry, like every industry, is stronger when it includes diverse perspectives and experiences." Later that evening in a San Francisco hotel ballroom, Harold Wilson stood uncomfortably at the periphery of a networking reception. The past months had been professionally devastating for him as well. After Alicia Diaz's video went viral, his comments had been clearly audible and immediately identifiable. Meridian Financial, horrified by the potential damage to their reputation, had placed him on administrative leave pending an investigation. That investigation had revealed a history of complaints from minority colleagues about Wilson's dismissive behavior and subtle undermining tactics. 2 female executives had specifically cited instances where Wilson had taken credit for their ideas or excluded them from critical meetings. The resulting report had led to his termination for violation of the company's code of conduct. Now, 6 weeks later, he was attending this finance conference in a desperate attempt to rebuild his network and find a new position. But word had spread throughout the industry, and he found himself repeatedly snubbed by former colleagues and potential employers alike. As he nursed a drink in the corner, he overheard 2 executives nearby discussing Atlantic Airways' transformation and its ripple effects through the corporate world. Johnson turned a PR nightmare into a masterclass in corporate responsibility, one was saying. Their stock is up 12% since they implemented those changes. It's forcing everyone to take a hard look at their own houses, the other agreed. Our board just approved a complete overhaul of our D&I initiatives based on their model. Wilson drained his glass, bitter realization washing over him. While he had lost everything because of his behavior that day, Atlantic Airways had emerged stronger than ever. The irony was not lost on him as he slipped out of the reception unnoticed and unmissed. Back in Atlanta, as dusk fell over the city, Marcus Johnson sat in his home office, reviewing the day's reports. The transformation at Atlantic Airways was gaining momentum with measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, particularly among minority staff. Passenger surveys showed increased confidence in the airline's commitment to equitable treatment. Industry publications had begun citing their approach as a potential model for other corporations facing similar challenges. But for Marcus, the most significant change wasn't captured in any corporate metric or financial report. It was in the message he had received from Jasmine earlier that day, a photo of her with a group of young black and brown students she had mentored through her new organization, Elevate STEM, which focused on supporting minority students interested in science and technology. "Look what grew from that terrible day," her text read. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best beginnings." Marcus smiled at the wisdom of his daughter, who at 17 had already learned a lesson that many never grasp. In a lifetime, that transformation often begins with confrontation, that growth requires discomfort, and that justice, though slow and imperfect, is always worth fighting for. As he closed his laptop, Marcus reflected on how a single incident on a single flight had catalyzed changes that were now rippling outward in ever-widening circles, touching lives, transforming institutions, and perhaps in some small but a significant way, bending the long arc of history just a little more firmly toward justice. 1 year later, Jasmine Johnson stood in the bustling terminal of San Francisco International Airport, her Stanford University ID card hanging on a lanyard around her neck. At 18, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been present when she'd first flown here on that fateful day. Now, a freshman studying atmospheric sciences with a minor in social justice, Jasmine had found her voice and her purpose. Her algorithm had won first place at the national competition, leading to publication in a prestigious scientific journal and a feature in Time magazine's Next Generation Leaders issue. But more importantly, the experience on Flight 327 had reshaped her understanding of her own power and responsibility. As she approached the gate for her flight back to Atlanta for spring break, Jasmine noticed how different the atmosphere felt. The Atlantic Airways gate agents were a visibly diverse group, and the boarding process proceeded with a kind of attentive inclusivity that felt deliberate rather than performative. When first-class passengers were called Jasmine, now dressed in Stanford sweats and sneakers, looking every bit the college student presented her boarding pass without a trace of the anxiety she had felt a year ago. "Welcome aboard." Miss Johnson greeted the flight attendant, a young man whose name tag read, "Michael Stevens. Seat 3 Amperes is on your right." Jasmine thanked him and made her way to her seat, the same one she had occupied during that life-changing flight. As she stowed her backpack and settled in, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed and how some things remained painfully the same. Her organization, Elevate STEM, had grown from a small student club to a national network with chapters at universities across the country. They provided mentorship resources and community for minority students pursuing careers in science and technology. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding, especially when she received messages from young Black and brown students who saw themselves represented in STEM fields for the first time. She was pulled from her thoughts by the flight attendant's return. "Excuse me, Miss Johnson," Michael said quietly. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I recognized your name from the passenger manifest. I wanted to thank you." Jasmine looked up in surprise. "Thank me? For what?" Michael glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Your story, what happened on that flight a year ago, it changed everything. Not just at Atlantic Airways, but for people like me." He gestured subtly to himself, a young Black man in a profession where he remained a minority. "I left a corporate job to become a flight attendant after following the changes your father implemented. I wanted to be part of that transformation." Jasmine was momentarily speechless. It had never occurred to her that her humiliating experience had inspired others to take action to reclaim spaces where they had previously felt unwelcome. "That means a lot," she finally said. "Thank you for telling me." Michael smiled. "Thank you for standing your ground that day. It mattered more than you know." With that, he continued his pre-flight duties, leaving Jasmine to absorb this unexpected perspective on what had happened. As the cabin filled, Jasmine noticed a young Latina girl, perhaps 14 or 15, being directed to a middle seat in economy by her mother. The girl looked nervous, clutching her backpack tightly, clearly flying alone for the first time. Without overthinking it, Jasmine stood and approached them. "Excuse me," she said with a warm smile. "I couldn't help noticing this might be your first time flying alone." The girl nodded shyly.
"Yes, I'm going to visit my grandmother in Atlanta."
"I remember my first solo flight," Jasmine said. "It can be a little intimidating. Would you like to sit in first class? Instead, I can take your seat in economy." The mother looked shocked. "Oh no, we couldn't possibly." "Please," Jasmine insisted. "I've flown this route many times. It would be my pleasure." After some gentle persuasion, the swap was arranged. Jasmine helped the girl, whose name was Isabella, get settled in seat 3 Amperes, explaining the first-class amenities and reassuring her about the journey ahead. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Isabella asked. As Jasmine prepared to move to economy, Jasmine thought for a moment. "Because a year ago, someone made me feel like I didn't belong in this seat. I want you to know that you belong anywhere your abilities and dreams can take you, first class included." As she turned to leave, her phone rang. It was her father. "Hey, Dad," she answered, moving toward her new seat in economy. "Just checking in before your flight," Marcus said. "Everything okay?" Jasmine smiled. "Better than okay. I just gave up my first-class seat to a young girl who reminded me of myself." There was a brief silence on the line, then a low chuckle. "That doesn't surprise me one bit. You've always had a bigger heart than me." "I learned from the best," Jasmine countered. "How are things at Atlantic?" "Changing," Marcus replied. "Slowly but surely. The new training program has been implemented across all 11,000 employees. Complaints of discriminatory treatment are down 78%, and when they do occur, they're handled completely differently." "And the Diversity Advisory Board?" Jasmine asked. "Alicia Diaz is a force of nature," Marcus said with admiration in his voice. "She's pushed us further and faster than we might have gone on our own. We're not perfect, not by a long shot, but we're moving in the right direction." Any word on Rebecca Matthews? Jasmine had often wondered what had happened to the flight attendant whose actions had set everything in motion. "Interestingly, yes," Marcus replied. "She reached out a few months ago. After a lot of soul-searching, she's become something of an advocate for bias awareness. She gives talks about her experience and what she learned from it. She asked if she could address our new flight attendant training class." "What did you say?" "I said yes. Her story, painfully honest about her own failings, has been more effective than a dozen HR presentations could ever be." The final boarding call was announced, prompting Jasmine to wrap up the call. "I should go, Dad. See you in a few hours." "Safe travels, sweetheart. I'm so proud of who you've become." As Jasmine settled into her economy seat, she thought about her father's words. Who she had become was someone who understood both the privilege she held and the responsibility that came with it. Someone who recognized that true change required both speaking truth to power and using whatever power you had to amplify silenced voices. The plane began its taxi toward the runway. From her window seat, Jasmine could see the vast operation of the airport ground crew maintenance teams, control tower, all working in coordinated harmony to launch this metal tube into the sky. It struck her as a fitting metaphor for the work of social change. Countless individuals, each playing their part, creating momentum that eventually defied the very gravity of entrenched systems. A year ago, she had boarded a flight as an excited teenager heading to a science competition, only to be confronted with the harsh reality of racism that no amount of academic achievement could shield her from. Today, she was returning home as a young woman with a clearer understanding of both the challenges ahead and her own capacity to meet them. As the plane lifted off, rising above the San Francisco Bay toward the vast expanse of sky, Jasmine felt a sense of possibility that extended far beyond her own journey. The incident that had once brought her to tears had sparked changes that continued to unfold in ways she could never have imagined. She thought of Isabella experiencing her first taste of first-class travel, perhaps having her own assumptions challenged about where she belonged. She thought of Michael Stevens, who had changed careers to be part of a more inclusive airline industry. She thought of her father, who had used his position of power not just to right a personal wrong, but to institute systemic change. Most of all, she thought about her own role in this continuing story. As a Black woman pursuing a STEM career, as the founder of an organization dedicated to lifting others up, as someone who now understood the responsibility that came with having her voice heard, she was part of a much larger transformation than any single flight or incident could encompass. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Let me know when you land safely. Love you." Jasmine smiled as she replied, their relationship stronger now than it had ever been. They had always been close, but the shared experience of confronting injustice together had forged a deeper understanding between them, a recognition that their individual struggles were part of a collective journey toward a more equitable world. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Jasmine pulled out her laptop to review her presentation for the upcoming TEDx talk she would be giving at Stanford. The title slide read, From confrontation to transformation, how one moment changed an industry. She had come to understand that change rarely happened through comfort or convenience. It happened in moments of crisis when people were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. It happened when individuals like Alicia Diaz chose to speak up rather than remain silent, when leaders like her father chose accountability over defensiveness, and when institutions recognized that diversity wasn't just about optics, but about fundamentally reimagining who belonged in spaces of power and privilege. The Atlantic Airways logo on the napkin beside her drink reminded her of how far things had come and how much further there was to go. One airline had changed its practices, but countless other industries remained riddled with the same biases and barriers. Her work, she knew, was just beginning. As the flight attendants began the beverage service, Jasmine closed her laptop and gazed out the window at the endless horizon. Sometimes, transformation began with a single moment of injustice, a single act of courage, a single voice refusing to be silenced. Sometimes it began with tears in a first-class cabin and ended with something much larger, a ripple effect of change that continued long after the initial splash had subsided. For Jasmine Johnson, what had started as a humiliating confrontation had become the catalyst for her life's purpose. And as the plane carried her eastward toward home, she carried with her the knowledge that the most powerful response to discrimination wasn't just resistance, it was transformation. This powerful story reminds us that discrimination often thrives in environments where it goes unchallenged. Rebecca's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern enabled by flawed systems and silent bystanders. True change requires both individual courage and institutional accountability. Jasmine's experience illustrates how prejudice persists regardless of achievement or status. Even as the daughter of a CEO, she faced discrimination based solely on appearance. Yet the story also demonstrates the transformative power of confronting injustice directly. We see different responses to witnessing discrimination: Alicia's immediate intervention, Tyler's delayed action, Franklin's regretful silence, and Harold's active reinforcement. Each choice had consequences that rippled far beyond that single flight. Most importantly, the narrative shows that authentic transformation isn't about quick fixes or public relations. It requires honest self-examination, structural changes, and ongoing commitment. Atlantic Airways didn't just fire one employee, they rebuilt their entire culture. The story challenges us to consider our own role in situations of injustice. Are we silent observers, active participants, or courageous advocates? Sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the most painful moments, transforming individual trauma into collective progress toward a more equitable world. What moment in your life challenged you to speak up against injustice? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and remained silent, or found the courage to intervene? Your voice matters more than you might realize. Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's continue this important conversation together. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that highlight important social issues, and share this video with someone who needs this message today. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the face of discrimination, silence is compliance, but courage creates change. Until next time.